following my videos, you know that I like to make these etudes. I shouldn't call them etudes, they're more like workout sessions. Bebop workout sessions. I've done one for Donna Lee and jazz blues. So this time we'll take a look at a minor blues, and I mean like a minor jazz blues, like Mr P.C. That's a good tune. John Coltrane's tune, Mr P.C. So these are 9 pages of exercises. I hope I can go through all of them, and I'll also explain why we pick certain bop scales. I got a question, somebody was asking how come we pick this specific minor bop scale when we play with minor chords. So hopefully I can clarify that during this video and give you the exercises. So let's get right into it, shall we? Before we do anything else, let's just look at the chords I'm going to use for this minor blues. There are variations, but this is a good kind of default setting for chords for a minor blues like Mr P.C. C minor, F minor, first chord, for example, it could be a minor 6, minor major 7 even, but we'll just treat it as a minor 7 to F minor 7, and this A flat is a chord. We're going to use Lydian flat 7, so we could throw in a sharp 11 there if you wanted to. The G7, we're going to think Phrygian dominant. Alright, so what are the scales we're going to use? Dorian. So C Dorian. There are many scales you could use for minor chords, but in this case we're just going to use Dorian for now. So we're going to play them descending. F Dorian, C Dorian. And then the scale I want to use for the A flat is Lydian dominant, which happens to be the same thing as E flat melodic minor. So we're going to play an E flat melodic minor scale there. That's an E flat melodic minor. Same notes, share the same notes as A flat Lydian flat 7. And then Phrygian dominant for G. So it's a Mixolydian scale with a flat 6 and a flat 9. So it sounds like this. So again, there are many options. You could play Mixolydian for the A flat 7. The reason I picked that Lydian flat 7 is because that A flat is kind of a sub 5 of D, right? So I want to maintain that D. But you could play Mixolydian, and obviously you could play altered over the G, but I think we sometimes go to the altered scale too quickly. It's nothing wrong with the Phrygian dominant. You just have to make it sound like jazz. So the Phrygian dominant scale is a mode of harmonic minor, C harmonic minor, starting on G. And I remember when I was learning to play jazz, I thought, well, that scale doesn't belong in jazz. It's kind of like a heavy metal scale or a flamenco scale or something. But if you make it sound like jazz, adding some chromaticism, it's a great scale for jazz. So that was an important lesson for me. Alright, so now let's make them bop scales, meaning we're just adding a note so that we end up with chord tones on strong beats. I have explained this idea in many of my previous videos, so you might want to go and check some of those out if you don't know what I'm talking about. But here's the thing, the scale we're gonna pick for C minor is actually F mixo bop scale. What? And there is a reason for that. I'll get to that later on, but for now just trust me. When you see C minor 7, we're gonna think F7, and we're gonna play a Mixolydian scale with a major 7. Over C minor. Sounds great over C minor. So I have to do a little bit of transposing in my head. And then F minor, well then it's B flat. Mixolydian, and then back to C minor. And the A flat, we're doing E flat melodic minor bop scale, meaning we have to add a note. A flat 6. So it's the same thing as a major bop scale, you add a flat 6. Works great over that chord. And the G7, we play Phrygian dominant with a major 7. Just listen to if I don't play a bop scale, if I just play the regular scale. I land on the notes you don't want to land on the strong beats. But if I add that major 7, I'm outlining the chord, the harmony. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And then there are passing notes. So I'm playing chord tones with passing notes on the weak beats, which is the idea of bop scales. So if I do that, starting on the root of each scale, meaning I'm starting on F for F mixo, don't get confused here. It's a C minor chord, but in my head I'm thinking F7, and I'll explain why. And just starting on the root, it's going to sound like this. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of the fourth bar. You could create an altered chord there, but we're not doing that for this exercise. But you could totally play C altered or C dominant there, bar 4, leading to F. But I want to keep it a little bit simple, so I'm not doing that. So if I play the scales, hopefully you can hear the harmony. So the next exercise in my excellent little booklet here is just adding a bebop phrase at the end. So I'm gonna slide from A to G with my index finger. This is not a lesson on fingerings. You have to figure out your own fingerings, but what I'm doing is sliding to G there. Same thing for B flat. So let's give it a listen. So there are many fingerings you could use. You have to find a way that works, and you should also play these scales in any position, right? But there's not enough time for me to go over all that stuff in this video. It will take forever. Next thing to do is to start on the third. So remember, we're thinking F7. So the third of F7 is A. That sounds great over. It might seem weird, but if I play C minor, it sounds great. I think. And then same thing, B flat, the third is D. So then the third of E flat minor, because remember we're thinking E flat melodic minor, is G flat. And the third of G is B. So the funny skip there. You could play B flat if you wanted to. It also works. So it's up for grabs, B or B flat. Let's give it a listen, shall we? So the backing track you're hearing, the play along, is the iReal Pro app. So this might be a good time to explain why we're using this F Mixolydian scale. Or I'll try to explain why we're using another scale, because that was the question. Somebody asked me, how come we're not using like a C Dorian with a added 7 or something? Which you could do. Let's say a C Dorian and add a major 7. You can totally do that. It's not a very strong sound. I think this is stronger. And I think the reason for that is, you know how often you play C minor to F7. So for example, if we're playing Honeysuckle Rose. Right? This is almost the same chord. What a lot of jazz musicians do, especially kind of more old school jazz musicians, they ignore that C minor chord and think just F7. Barry Harris also talks about that a lot. Just think the dominant chord. And then, well, that is the F Mixolydian scale, right? So then you just play the Bop scale over both those two chords. Only here we don't have the F7, but it's almost as if it is there. If you know what I mean? So a lot of early jazz players, for example, when they play that tune, they wouldn't even play that C minor, they would just play F7. That's really old school. So a lot of times those standards you see in the real book, the 2 chord is not even supposed to be there from the beginning. It came later with the Bebop. And now the tune is what is this thing called love? It's just dominant chords. But then we kind of added the two chords, the relative two chords later on. Now, if the minor chord has a tonic function in a tune, then it's a whole different thing. And here we're thinking kind of modally. I'm thinking of the first chord as a mode and then the next chord as a mode. So I'm just playing Dorian. I hope that's not confusing. Alright, next thing we'll do is we're just gonna add another bop phrase. The Donna Lee phrase. So that's just an A minor 7 flat 5 arpeggio. So that will sound like this. Another thing you can do is to add even more chromatic notes from the third of F7A. You can go down chromatically to F and then just continue on the Bop scale. It's called this, I've seen people call it 10-note Bop scale. Then the same thing as before, which sounds like this. And of course you can play these scales ascending as well. We're just doing them descending now, and again, I don't want this video to go on forever. So these PDFs are, I think you know the drill, they're on my Patreon page. There's like 9 pages. And as always, a huge thank you to my Patreons, because it's a lot of work to do this. And I'm so happy that people are interested and want to learn this stuff. So I'm super excited. Now we're gonna start on the 5th. The 5th of F7 is C. So that's actually the root of the chord we're playing. Start on this note. And then finally we'll start on the 7th. So when on the E flat minor Bop scale we start on the 6th. for the A flat 7 when I'm playing E flat melodic minor. We're starting on the 6th because that has kind of the same function as the 7th. So if you find this stuff confusing, why I'm starting on certain notes and stuff like that, Jerry Bergonzi's book, Jazz Line, is by far the best book I've seen on Bop Scales. It explains Bop Scales in so many ways, way more than I'm covering here. There's all these other things you can do with Bop Scales that I'm not even talking about here. So Jerry Bergonzi's Jazz Line is a really good book. So here we can also add kind of a Donna Lee sounding phrase, which is an E flat major 7 arpeggio. I also want you to try to don't just always start on beat 1, so let's start on beat 2. And then we can add this "Thank you, David Baker" phrase. So David Baker wrote these Bop Scales books, these books that covers Bop Scales. This is another book if you want to study Bop Scales. David Baker's How to Play Bebop 1. That's why we like to joke. Every time we play this phrase, when we were in jazz school, we said, "Thank you, David Baker," because it sounds like you're saying, "Thank you, David Baker." That this stuff is way too easy. Maybe you've practiced your Bop Scales and you know your Bop Scales in and out. Other things you could do is try to pick a different key. Play all this stuff in E flat minor. See what happens. Or play it super fast. Can you play it at like 300 beats per minute? This is a good way. This is a good thing to work on if you want to work on your fast tempo playing. Also try to improvise using these scales, and don't just stay with what I've written out, but try to see if you can be more loose with it and start to improvise, play in different directions, and change notes around and what have you. We could also do this thing we did in the last video I did on this topic, the Donna Lee video, where we do this kind of pivot thing. So I'm playing it, but I'm pivoting. So I'm skipping an octave and jumping down instead of playing. So I'm playing instant Charlie Parker. Let's listen to that. Are you still with me? Another thing you can do, start on a pickup note Above, let's go back to the first thing we did where we started on F. Just add a pickup note. There's a lot you can do with that, starting on different notes, and Barry Harris has a whole system for it. There's a little bit of that in both the Jerry Bergonzi book I mentioned, as well as the David Baker book. They both talk about the idea of starting on different notes, because ultimately you want to be able to connect going from a chord to the next, which we're not really doing here. That's the goal of all this. You want to be able to connect your lines through the changes by using these concepts. So that is another thing that the Jerry Bergonzi book talks about. It's a whole chapter on connecting bop scales. And I have made a video on that in the past. Let's say we do want to treat that first chord as minor major 7, a melodic minor sound. Then I'll have to play this scale. C melodic minor, bop, adding a flat 6. So if the first chord is C melodic minor, so I'm gonna change that chord in iReal Pro. Just go into Edit and change the quality of the chord to minor major 7. Gives you a different feel. You could do the same thing for F minor, but it's a little bit to stretch things depending on how edgy you want to be. But I'm gonna keep the F minor the same that we had before, but I've heard people do that. You can totally do it, but it's a little bit outside, because then you get the E natural, which is the major 3rd of the key. So if I start on the root, and then the same as before, so then you would go through the whole process of starting on the 3rd of that scale and the 5th of that scale and the 6th, etc. You could start on with a triplet, very common thing. Again, sounds like Donna Lee. So if I start at 9th and then play that scale, it sounds like that. Then the 9th of B flat, right? Remember we played thinking B flat is C. 9th of E flat, because it's E flat melodic minor. There it is. There it is. And the 9th of G7 is A flat. So I'm playing to B flat there. It sounds better than... Let's listen to it. that G Phrygian dominant sounds very jazz. Instant jazz. So those kind of triplets and ornamentations make it sound more bebop. So let me know in the comments below if you have any questions, and thanks for your time and attention, and I shall see you next time.